Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Japan and the U.S. kick off their first round of trade negotiations. The talks are being held by U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and his Japanese counterpart. The U.S. has spelled out 22 specific negotiation areas, including non-tariff barriers in Japan's auto market. The U.S. has historically been Japan's biggest ally. However, trade ties between the two nations seem to have undergone some changes since President Donald Trump took office. Let's take a look.
Cars are a sore spot in U.S.-Japan relations. That's what U.S. President Donald Trump says about the economic ties between Washington and Tokyo. Trump believes trade with Japan is neither fair nor open.
The United States has a massive trade deficit with Japan, $100 billion a year. Japan sends us millions and millions of cars, and we tax them virtually not at all.
Since Washington's withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, or the TPP, economic ties between the old allies have soured. Last March, Trump levied a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum imported from all countries except Canada and Mexico. Japan is the only major ally not given an exception. Tokyo hit back with a threat to slap tariffs on U.S. imports worth over $400 million. No wonder Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe may be considering new market opening opportunities.
Now, when there is rising concern over protectionism in the world, there is more attention than ever from the world to see whether Asia can stay united and keep raising the flag of free trade.
Last July, Abe attended the ASEAN-related summit meetings, reaffirming Tokyo's support of the regional comprehensive economic partnership with ASEAN countries. Meanwhile, the talks for a China-Japan-South Korea free trade agreement are also underway. And on February 1st, the European Union-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement entered into force. Tokyo's strategy seems to be looking for leverage with as many countries and regions as possible for new trade opportunities. With Youyang, Timothy Ulrich for CGTN.
And for more on U.S.-Japan trade talks, we are joined in Hong Kong by Kato Yachikatsu, Adjunct Associate Professor of the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. And in our Beijing studio, we have Terry Miller, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN and also Director of the Center for International Trade and Economics from the Heritage Foundation. It's good to have you here in our Beijing studio.
It's good to be
here. And
here.
also Professor Wu Chang-chi from the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University. Welcome, Professor, as well.
Thank you.
I want to start with you, Ambassador Miller. How necessary, if you think about it, is it for this trade talks between Japan and the United States? What really can be achieved now?
I think a lot can be achieved. There are obvious tensions in the world trading system right now, many of them caused by my own country. But nonetheless, it's in the interest of all of countries, I think, Japan, China, the United States, and all of our trading partners to work as cooperatively as we can to work out our differences. And there are differences between the United States and Japan.
Like what? What do you think is the issue here? There's a lot of talk about currency, but certainly there are other issues as well.
Yes, I actually don't think currency is a very important issue between the United States and Japan. Japan's not what I would term a currency manipulator, so I think there will be a provision there, but it will just be a pro forma mention of currency. Much more important are things like agricultural trade for the United States, and from the Japanese side, the need to maintain their automobile exports to the United States.
Well, now, Mr. Kato, those are very passionate topics for Japanese, certainly, the Japanese farmers and also the car manufacturers. Mr. Kato, what can you expect, really, from Tokyo's perspective?
I think, of course, this is a very important talk, and I think Japan and the United States are going to talk very positive manner, and frankly. But I think maybe U.S. and Japan now we have some different concerns. For example, Japan make more emphasis on TAG, a trade agreement on goods. But maybe the United States want to talk about currency issue. And now Japanese government want to put these issues in more multilateral ways. But U.S. Trump administration wants to be more sticky to the bilateral way. So I think U.S. and Japan, we are allies. That's why we can talk very frankly, and we can have basic trust mutually. But now we have some different concerns and even different interests on these issues. So I think it's unlikely to be resolved very quickly.
Well, Mr. Kato, I want to follow up a little bit. I mean, talk friendly, certainly that's a beautiful thing, but will talk friendly necessarily going to solve the problem? That's not necessarily leading from one to the other, is it?
Yeah. I think it's unlikely to be resolved very quickly, because now of course Japan, we are very making a point of the relation with the United States. Even the Mr. Trump takes office, but maybe he is implementing some irresponsible or some inward-looking policies. But we still trying to talk with Mr. Trump and want to strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliances.
Ambassador Miller, I have to come back to you now. I mean, you think about that. There are certainly economic and trade issues, but on the other hand, there's also ideology issues. And ideology, I didn't mean political system, but rather how do you look at the world trade that should be run? From Japan's perspective, obviously multilateral for a smaller, relatively, economy and smaller population, that's the way to go. But for the United States, the current administration looking at bilateral as this favorite.
Well, there's certain...
And the deal, so-called.
There's a certain amount of dissatisfaction right now, certainly by the Trump administration, with the performance of the World Trade Organization in particular.
WTO negotiation is going to happen later this year as different countries put in already their proposals for how to reform. But there are other platforms, like multilateral, rather than just the WTO. For example, CPTPP, which Japan is absolutely passionate about, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, of course, and that's a big advantage for these trade talks between the United States and Japan, because a lot of the heavy lifting in this negotiation has already been accomplished in the context of negotiations for the TPP. So the U.S. withdrew from that process, but nonetheless, there's a pretty good understanding between the Japanese side and the U.S. side of where a possible agreement might lie between the two countries.
Is it? Mr. Kato?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think, of course, TPP, now we say TPP 11. Of course, it's a pity that the United States, withdraw from the TPP, but now Japan is still trying to lead the negotiating process, I think, and Japanese, want to believe the United States could be back in the future. So now what we can do is consistently, promoting this trade TPP and including some, regional agreement based on the free and fair, multilateralism and trade system, and this is very important for Asia-Pacific region.
It is a multilateral approach for the Asia-Pacific region. Professor Wu, you've been tentatively listening to your two other colleagues from Japan and the American side. Now it's your time to talk, I guess. There are two things going on at the same time. One is U.S.-China trade negotiations, which is likely to pave the way for the nature of a new stage of relationship between the two countries. On the other hand, you also have China-Japan getting a little bit much closer than it used to be. After all, the foreign minister is visiting China, and we're seeing G20 summits likely to taking place with the two heads of states also likely to meet, but we do not know yet for the moment. But Professor, it's a very mixed picture, isn't it? How is China feeling about this? I mean, right now, this hot topic also, trade negotiations between the United States and Japan.
I think in a broader view, that current tensions and negotiations are under a process of deepening of globalization. Because when World Trade Organization was established in 1995, actually that pushed the globalization, that stimulated the international trade. When trade volume picked up, particularly in China, became major trade partners with many countries. So the traditional World Trade Organization, the framework, has some tensions. So now, particularly after Trump administration, right, and they want to get out its world trade system. They want to have a bilateral, right, China and the U.S. Talk about trade tensions. But now I think, by and large, so you see the people, not only myself, are more optimistic about the U.S.-China trade negotiations. The major obstacles has been ironed out, right? There are such remaining ones. But regarding China and Japan's trade relationship, of course, these are both with U.S. and with China, with Japan, are two of the major trading partners. But of course, China, and for the past quite some time, China trying to stimulate the regional trade with free trade agreement. But that's because of the atmosphere, right? And other kind of the right, and it was put on hold. But now it's accelerating. Japan, Korea, and China, right? That is the big framework. For instance, if Japan has a political will and the will of business communities, probably that could accelerate.
So it seems that it's a fascinating picture. I mean, the three gentlemen that I'm talking to, you have just described. It's everybody play with all kinds of options that they have on hand, whether they really like it or they pretend not to like it. So, Mr. Kato, for Japan, there must be a bottom line and a tipping point when it comes to a negotiation of any kind. So, what is it for Japan?
Actually, Japan and the United States, we have been allied for a long time.
Yes.
So sometimes we need to distribute our mission. So now we are looking at relatively, the U.S. is somehow reluctant to make a commitment to this region. So now it's a chance for Japan. Japan can implement some leadership on promoting these regional trade negotiations. Actually, this is a great political chance for Mr. Abe as well. So now Japan is trying to implementing these negotiations simultaneously. One is TPP-11, one is RCEP. When our Foreign Minister Kono Taro visited Beijing, they say we want to conclude our RCEP negotiation within the end of this year, or we want to make more commitment on Japan, China, and ROK's free trade agreement.
Mr.
So
Kato,
now
we
can implement.
Yes, we are saying that, Mr. Kato. I see you saying it with a lot of light in your eyes. This is certainly an opportunity for Japan, as you have just described. But Mr. Wu, Professor, tell us about that. I mean, TPP, of course, China is not part of it. China has not been invited. Well, there's agreement about whether it's being invited or not. But on the other hand, RCEP, RCEP, it's a big concept that many here in Asia Pacific subscribe to, certainly China included. So how are you seeing that China is also playing different hands? Multilateral, bilateral, regional, different concepts. Can China be a winner? Well, the U.S. and Japan are continuing with their allied relationship, but at the same time discussing about trade, to say the least. Professor?
I think indeed all these measures are largely trade promotion measures.
Exactly.
Right? Even, let's say, U.S.-China trade negotiation, let's China also introduce some further deepening and opening of its economy. Right? With the RCEP, that has been negotiated for quite some time, but it is very complex because it involves two of the most populous nations, China and India, and other things. But of course, the economy development level, also these regions are very much diverse. But this, if they go through, that's definitely, China would be one of the beneficiaries.
In the 1970s, Mr. Ambassador, Japan and the United States were in a trade war.
Yes.
And of course, the two economies taking shape as a result of it in very different ways. And some also argue the so-called lost 10 years or even 20 years of Japan had anything to do with it. Now, we are seeing China and the U.S. now at a different juncture of trade discussion. So, which is making our discussion today ever more relevant to see where were the past and what is the present and how can we see the future. So, Mr. Ambassador, I want to have some of your thoughts because you've been experiencing different parts of what I just mentioned.
Yes, and it's interesting that...
And it's not a diplomatic answer.
Some of the, we're hearing some of the same rhetoric now between the United States and China that we heard between the United States and Japan 30 years ago. And I think the parameters of the negotiation even are similar in some respects. But there are tremendous opportunities for all of the countries in the region to promote trade and increase their prosperity, and it doesn't particularly matter which country takes the lead in this process. If we can be leaders in that process from the United States, that's great, but if Japan can take a leadership role, that's great too. If China can, the challenge for China is that it still lags behind some of the other countries in the region in terms of its economic policies, its free market type policies, and And that, of course, is one of the issues between China and some of the other countries. So the question with these China-centered agreements is what kind of standards will actually be employed in them? Will they be the same high standards that we expect in trade between Japan, the European Union, the United States, and other countries?
Standard is, of course, one thing, and that has been very much worked on from China's perspective, at least. But on the other hand, Professor Wu, there's one concept that Ambassador Miller just mentioned. I'm not sure whether the Chinese really agree with that. That is China-centered mechanisms. As China has been at least talking about it, about the win-win situation and the mechanism, everybody become a player and have interactions with one another rather than a China-centered or a geopolitics-centered approach. Professor Wu.
Actually, that's an interesting issue because in the world after the Second World War, by and large, trade and investment are U.S.-centric. That means if any companies want to make a big company, you have to do well in the U.S. market. The Japanese companies, the Korean companies doing the same. But in last 10 to 20 years, particularly China became a member of World Trade Organization, the many of manufacturer activities takes place in the mainland China. So that China becomes the world manufacturing center. So many
and
of
now it's different also.
Now it's still moving that direction, still, right? Of course, we could broaden this to North Asia,
yes.
Japan, Korea, and mainland China. Right, that become manufacturing center of the world. So for many businesses, particularly from developing countries, they find their product, their raw materials could serve China. In that process, they would benefit from that. I would not rather call it China-centric, right? But at least China is one of the center of economic activity at the current state of the world.
Right. Knowing the fact that you two know each other already before you come into the studio, this is already quite an interesting debate. But
we are in an academic organization that promote international business. That's called Academy of International Business.
Right, exactly. We'll have you to talk a bit later, but Mr. Kato, I still want to involve you into this conversation. How do you see that? I mean, history, present, future, in a way, all in this taking place now as we speak. Mr. Kato.
Yeah, I think for Japan, there are very few space to pursue because we are allies with the United States. But now China is the largest trading partner for Japan. And we are located in Asia-Pacific region. So what we can do is, on one hand, strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance. But we want to push U.S. be more responsible for regional integration. And at the same time, Mr. Ambassador said, we are still a bit skeptical on which kind of way China are going to pursue, including so-called China model. So that's why China, I believe China wants to be more accountable, more transparent. So Japan needs to work with China at the same time in order to realize more rule and value-based multilateral free trade system and the regional integration. So this is what Japan can do, and this is exactly what Japan wants to do.
And it seems that,
in the future.
Okay, got it. Mr. Kato said very interestingly, because even on infrastructure building these days, Professor Wu, that Japan and China begins to see one another as opportunities. That is quite a movement, shall we say, compared to, let's just say, half a year ago. So how do you see this potential that everyone plays all the possibilities as much as possible for what you consider as promotion of trade and economic exchanges? Professor Wu, briefly from you.
Actually, China and Japan cooperate in many fronts, but the infrastructure construction definitely is one of them. Because actually Japanese company move abroad much earlier than China. And China's Belt and Road Initiative only recent thing, but they can learn from each other, cooperate in some of infrastructure projects. But it's not one country's work. It's helping developing countries to build the infrastructure and promote trade.
Right. When we start our conversation, it was only about Japan-U.S. trade negotiations. But none of the topics these days, if you look at our world, borrowing your word, globalization, can only be examined with one angle, but rather different ways. So before we go, one final sentence from every one of you. How do you see that negotiations going? What is going to tell us about it? What is that going to tell us about? Mr. Ambassador.
The U.S. and Japan have a very solid economic base and relationship together. Look for a negotiation that's going to continue for some time and have a positive result.
All right, Mr. Kato.
Yeah, I agree. U.S. and Japan, U.S. Japan can work together and push forward our multilateral and rule and value-based regional integration. But we have to learn to work with China.
Okay, all right. Last but not least, Professor Wu.
Before I came, I visited U.S. Trade Representative Office website. As mentioned, highlighted by U.S.-Japan trade negotiations. I look at the item. It seems to be in 40 years ago, same item. Auto trade, agricultural. After 50 years, the trade negotiators still negotiate that thing, right? That thing is something, of course, the frictions may not easily go away, but people would work out somewhere, move ahead.
With that positive note, well, do we have a positive note? It seems we have. Professor Wu Changqi, Ambassador Terry Miller, and Mr. Kato Yoshikatsu. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Goodbye.